Yes, we are looking for the guy who knows the guy, who analyzed the guy, who coordinated the guy, who directed the guy, who executed the guy, who implemented the guy, who organized the guy, who planned the guy, who reported the guy, who supervised the guy, who allocated the guy, who analyzed the guy, who appraised the guy, who audited the guy, who balanced the guy, who budgeted the guy, who calculated the guy, who estimated the guy. That guy, that's the guy that projected the guy, who arbitrated the guy, who counseled the guy, who edited the guy. Well, I'm looking for that guy because um, I need to find him for the guy who formulated the guy, who moderated the guy, who negotiated the guy, who persuaded the guy, who promoted the guy, who publicized the guy, who wrote to the guy, who composed to the guy, who conceived the guy, who conceptualized the guy, who created the guy, who designed the guy, who developed the guy, who established the guy, who formed the guy, who still illustrated the guy, who produced the guy, who collected the guy, who critiqued the guy, diagnosed the guy, evaluated the guy, examined the guy, who investigated the guy, who researched the guy, who reviewed the guy, who summarized the guy, who systemized the guy,